always shouting just to be heard.
Really?
How's Layla holding up downstairs?
She's doing great.
Yeah?
Yeah, she's killing it.
and woke up in the middle of her, yeah, Detroit, and then it's a 2-hour drive to Kalamazoo.
I had the same thing where I thought,
to Detroit?
well, no, but I thought this was 3 hours away from where I live, and it was in fact 6 hours away. And
Did you drive?
Because I was, because I was like, it's just a quick, jaunty little.
I'm in Manhattan, Kansas.
Hey, everybody.
Gotcha.
That's good.
They're really proud
The
of
little apple. That's pretty good.
We're ready to start. Are you guys ready? Great. I'm back. I'm Caitlin. You know me. Chair of the board. I am introducing our moderator, Gail Martin. Gail Martin's third collection, Disappearing Queen, won the 2 Sylvius Press Wilder Prize in 2021. Begin Empty-Handed won the Perugia Press Poetry Prize in 2013. And the following year was winner of the Housatonic Book Award for Poetry. The Hourglass Heart, out by New Issues Prose and Poetry, was published in 2003. Wonderful. We got it. Recently, her work has been featured in both Poetry Daily and Verse Daily. She works as a psychotherapist in private practice here in Kalamazoo. She also happens to be my mother and one of my favorite poets. Yay!
It is a big deal. You have no idea what a big deal. Thank you for keeping it professional, Katie. Thank you to everyone who contributed to this event. There was a lot of seed planting and a lot of cultivating and watering and weeding and all of those things. I don't want to overwork the metaphor, but anytime you're dealing with people and details, it's an enormous task, and we are the beneficiaries of a lot of hard work. And I'm feeling really lucky that I get to have this conversation with 3 poets that I esteem highly. I am just going to ask that if I do anything with the mic that is giving feedback, will someone do something dramatic that I notice? Yeah.
Perfect.
Are you doing that because I...
No. It was a dress.
It's another one of my
today.
offspring.
Oh, really?
I know. I'm going to read the list of achievements of our guest poets. I know it's really easy to tune out when the list is substantial, but I'm going to urge you to tune in. The complexities and awfulness of the world's present moment sometimes overshadows everything. I want you to look at what these 3 human beings have already brought into the world. What a flowering, and if you add up their ages, they're probably not even 100. So we have a lot to look forward to. It is with great admiration that I introduce you to Hala Alian, Kaveh Akbar, and Tracy Brimhall. If these bios need updating, it's not my fault. So, and I think there have been a couple of changes. Hala Alian is the author of the novel Salt Houses, winner of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize and the Arab American Book Award, and a finalist for the Chautauqua Prize, as well as the novel The Arsonist City, released in 2020, and 4 award-winning collections of poetry, most recently, You're Not a Girl in a Movie, 2021, and the 29th year, 2019. Her work has been published by The New Yorker, the Academy of American Poets, Lit Hub, the New York Times Book Review, and Guernica. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband, and I think a bambino.
And a daughter.
Yeah, and a daughter. And she works as a clinical psychologist. Kaveh Akbar is the author of Pilgrim Bell, Grey Wolf, 2021, and Calling a Wolf, Alice James Books, 2017. He is the author of a chapbook, Portrait of the Alcoholic, Sibling Rivalry Press, 2017. He's the editor of the Penguin Book of Spiritual Verse, 110 Poets on the Divine. Kaveh is the recipient of the Levis Reading Prize, multiple Pushcart Prizes, Ruth Lilly and Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Poetry Fellowship, and Civitella Ranieri Fellowship. Kaveh is the founding editor of Dive Dapper, a home for interviews with major voices in contemporary poetry. Born in Tehran, he teaches at not Purdue now. He teaches at not Purdue, but Iowa, and in the low residency MFA programs at Randolph College and Warren Wilson. His poems appear in The New Yorker, Poetry, PBS NewsHour, Paris Review, Best American Poetry, The New York Times, and elsewhere. Kaveh currently serves as poetry editor for The Nation. That's the publication, not the country. Tracy Brimall is the author of 4 poetry collections: Come the Slumberless to the Land of Nod, Copper Canyon, Sodaje, Copper Canyon, Our Lady of the Ruins, W.W. Norton, winner of the Bernard Women Poets Prize, and Rookery, Southern Illinois University Press, winner of the Crab Orchard Series in Poetry First Book Award. Her poems have appeared in The New Yorker, Poetry, The Believer, The New Republic, Orion, New York Times Magazine, and Best American Poetry. She has received fellowships from the Wisconsin Institute for Creative Writing and the National Endowment for the Arts, and she is Poet Laureate of Kansas. Ooh. So yay, help me welcome these 3. Beginnings are a little hard. I've been telling people I'm looking for that sweet spot between the diaspora and what's your favorite musical, and I'm not sure that I've really identified it, but I thought we would start with a process question about what gets us started on poems. Bronwyn Tate talks about a shifting approach in her writing where she moved from being very explicit in her intentions, like every day I will write for 30 minutes on sandpipers and family secrets, or 500 words on baseball and climate change, to engaging with some activity that supports writing or is a corollary to writing without actually being writing. And I'm curious to know what you think about that strategy and what your corollary would be. Any of you can go.
I just want to, I think my life changes, so the way I relate to writing has to change. I brought up in the class this morning on the Body Electric that when I was living and writing in New York City, I had a process, and then I moved to Wisconsin, and I was like, Wisconsin just doesn't have the magic. And then one day I was on the floor, and I bent over, and then all of a sudden I started to be able to write, because in New York City, I just wrote sitting on my bed, crisscross applesauce, and bent over. It was stressing me out. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
I was watching it.
I was like, I need to.
It was a wasp or something. Yeah,
Yeah,
it was.
yeah.
I was watching you very afraid, not because I was worried about the question, but I was watching the wasp behind you vigilantly. But then I realized that my body had learned that in that bent over position, crisscross applesauce and bent over my legs, that's when the writing happened. And I was like, oh no, that's not sustainable. I can't write like that forever. And then I invented a new, I always call it building the spell of like, what are the things I need to do with language or with my body that helps me start writing. And I also knew that I wanted to become a parent and that my time would go away and the way I'd be able to work would have to change. And so I went ahead and I changed writing before I had a kid, but then of course I didn't predict what being a parent was like, and then I had to change again. But just realizing that the circumstances of my life change, which creates a change in the voice of writing and what I'm able to do. But I think the biggest favor I try and do myself is I call them, sometimes I just say I'm writing a blob today, or I try and find ways to make it not heavy or like full of, like I must write a poem today, of just like I scrap write, or I say I'm going to record my 5 senses of the day, or I find ways in which to engage in writing that doesn't make me start judging myself. But ways in which writing is still play, ways in which writing is still pleasure, things like that, not things that try and get the word poem away from me so that I don't, carry too much expectation into the writing process itself.
Yeah, I think, is this on? Yes. I was gonna say that I think I had a similar, I started off very rigid, and so if you look at interviews after the first novel, the way that I wrote my 2 novels was that I wrote for 30 minutes a day, and that was my practice for like a decade. Every day, doesn't matter when, doesn't matter where, I would do 30 minutes, and I would try to leave the scene on a cliffhanger. So I feel like a lot of writing is trying to trick yourself into writing. So it's like trying to like have something to look forward to come back to the next day. And then the year of COVID happened, and with that came, for me, like a 2-year stretch of infertility and a bunch of miscarriages, and a time when the body was really, like I couldn't bear to be in the body in any way. And that included sitting, like being sedentary or like trying to mind the self for anything. I just felt like I just couldn't do it. And so when I talk about writing practice with students, I talk about grace a lot, and like giving yourself grace and like thinking about your life circumstances and whatever. And actually having a kid, shockingly, has been, like I thought my time was gonna get really warped and there was gonna be no time, but it turned out for me the block was the sort of like striving and the infertility and the COVID blech and all of that, that actually having a kid has been extremely inspiring. And I will say too, I have childcare part-time, and so 30 minutes means like something different than what 30 minutes used to mean. It means that I have 30 minutes to myself. Like those 10 minutes that I just was upstairs shoving food in my mouth, I was like, oh, like, so there's something about like now when I know that I am choosing to be sitting at this desk and reading or writing or whatever, instead of being with my daughter, and that there's someone watching her. It's not even financial, it's like emotional, where I'm like, I'm choosing to do this thing. You can't do 10 things at the same time. I am choosing to be attentive and to do this thing. Therefore, I can fully pour myself into it, and I find that my relationship to time and like presence has changed a lot. And I'll say in terms of like the corollaries, I really like, I find doing something that is incompatible with writing to help get the juices flowing. So showering, I do sculpting sometimes, so if my hands are in wet clay, I'll think of things, but I can't like write it down. Like I actually find it really useful to be doing things, particularly hand-based things like weaving or whatnot, because there's something about that gets me. Again, maybe it's just, I just want to do the things, I'm maybe just a contrarian, I don't know, but there's something about doing something and I'm like, now I can't be writing, and now suddenly all I want to do is like write these ideas down. No.
Is this one on? Hello? Yeah, cool. I think I turned it on by dropping it. Yeah, I don't have anything particularly interesting to add. I think that what's been said is pretty good. I'll say that it is often the case that a poet's form follows their living, right? Which is to say, I think that both Tracy and Hala have spoken beautifully to that, but you know, when asked why she wrote such short poems, Lucille Clifton, who was a mother of 4, said, that's how long I have, you know, like I have to, you know, that's how long it takes my kids to nap. And, you know, the great Kalamazoo poet, Oliver Bendorf, or great poet of Kalamazoo, his first book, the lines were very, very short, and he's spoken about this publicly. I'm not betraying any confidences. I've seen him speak about this in interviews, but his lines were very short, and then in his second book, the lines got quite longer, and when asked about that, he spoke about having top surgery and the way that he no longer had to bind his chest, and so he could inhale more deeply, right? And so he got more breath so the lines could get longer, right? And there are so many ways in which the strictures of our living shape the way that we sound on the page, and we're all coming from an unprecedented experience. No one in this room, I would wager, was born in Tehran, Iran, and then moved to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania when they were a child, and then moved to Trenton, New Jersey, and then and then moved to Milwaukee, and like no one has like followed the exact trajectory of my life, nor have you read the books that I've read in the order that I've read them, with like having the conversations in the order that I had them. You know what I'm saying? So like I have an unprecedented idiom, and so allowing the shape of my writing to reflect that, I think, illuminates both, right? It illuminates the living and it illuminates the writing.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. I got a great piece of advice years ago from Di Seuss, who said, keep your relationship to writing casual. And, it can just be anywhere, anytime, on your phone, on your arm. And Beth Ann Finley said after she completed writing a novel about deliberately lowering the stakes, which was what moved her to her micro memoir pieces, because if it totally sucks, at least I haven't spent 2 years writing it. So I liked that. Maybe this is a good place to talk a little bit about hybrid forms, and if that fits in with the generative piece and how you keep those fires going, great. Tracy, I know, push back if I get this wrong, but I remember you saying that you have I think you just said it, that you have a practice of writing bad poems.
Yeah.
And in your most recent book, you intersperse essays in with the poems. And Hala, I came to your writing first through the novels. I didn't know you wrote poetry. And Kaveh, it seems to me that the tone and certainly the form of your work in Pilgrim Bell is super different from the first book that I read, Calling a Wolf, among other things by using some pretty innovative punctuation. How do each of you, having so many tricks up your sleeve, decide which form best serves that which you're trying to express?
I don't want this conversation to make it feel like you have to start every time
was gonna
in
say
the
one
sort
of
of.
the-
I appreciate that. I was just going to say, you guys, you could just
and
like
so I will
sparkle in.
I will leap into the frame manfully, and say, yeah, that's a generous question. I also feel like I should defer because I think that you two work with hybridity more interestingly than I do. I just tend to write poems, and then when I'm writing prose, I just tend to be writing prose. But you spoke to the punctuation in Pilgrim Bell, which I suppose is a thing I can speak to. The first book that I wrote, Calling a Wolf, was it was written at a time in my life when I was getting sober, when I was like just at the beginning stages of very early sobriety. And the poems were very much a sort of place to put myself, where I could just be writing a poem for 3 or 5 hours and I wouldn't have to worry about accidentally killing myself. I mean, it really was that
They
simple.
felt like little life rafts to
Yeah,
me.
yeah, and that's what they were. They were sort of in every context of the word life raft. They were sort of like just slapshod put together, and I think that slapshodness is like, I'm not saying that in a pejorative way, but they were very much sort of uneven and wobbly, and they were also like super saturated. They were big and loud, and then once the membrane between me and an early preventable death had thickened a little bit, just marginally, just like an infinitesimal fraction of a millimeter, I think that I began to look outwards a little bit more, like beyond, the back of my own eyelids. And in that looking, I became very skeptical of, sorry, I'm thinking slowly. I became very skeptical of the language of certainty, just broadly speaking. I became very skeptical of certainty, and I realized that I was sort of suffused in the language of certainty on social media, you know, like, I don't know who needs to hear this, but blah, 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 you know, like, or like, you know, if you're not doing da-da-da-da-da, you should feel bad about yourself. You know, like, just like the language of certainty became, I found myself becoming very allergic to that. Because it's also the language of empire, right? Like, immigrants are evil, and, you know, climate change is a hoax, and this new Rolex will make you sexually irresistible. You know, like these, I'm serious, like, this is the language of empire, and it was also the language being used to induce shame among people that I felt were my comrades, right? And so I realized that in my increasing intolerance for that language, I realized that the English language, you know, the medium of my art, you know, there are 4 kinds of sentences. It's interrogative, imperative, declarative, and exclamatory. Well,
Exclamatory, interrogative, declarative,
and imperative. Yeah. That's what I said,
I
right?
didn't know any of those.
Yeah.
So good
I
job.
said that, right?
Good job.
I think I said that. Maybe not. I don't know.
You're like
I'm sorry.
4 kinds of stuff. I'm like, what do you
Yeah,
mean?
but I mean, like, the most common kinds are declarative and imperative, the kinds that we use most often in colloquial speech, and both of those are like you're declaring something to be the case, or you're telling someone to do something, right? Both of those are very certain of themselves, right? They're both, you know, it's a language built around these 2 different articulations of certainty. Both take the period, and so I became obsessed with the period in a way, and I became obsessed with ways to play from the period, its certainty. And so in Pilgrim Bell, there are many poems that are like hyper punctuated, like the ways that like Merwin and Clifton and Ellen Bryant Voigt sort of like sucked up all the periods and commas in their poems. There are poems in Pilgrim Bell that sort of do the opposite of that, right? Which is to just sort of like, you know, blow dandelion seeds of periods all over the, you know, all over the stanzas, and that was a way of training myself to look past certainty, you know, or just like it was like a practice in my living, you know. It was also just like a corrosive thing that I was doing in my own living, you know, within my marriage, within my teaching, within my relationship to the world, was like thinking in certainties and rushing to hasty, inorganic conclusions in order to resolve uncertainty. And so it was a way of training myself as well. I don't know if that answered your question at all.
That's beautifully said. You know, I was just saying this to someone that I always feel, I don't know if it's because I have not been formally trained in writing, or didn't know that there were 4 kinds of sentences, or didn't know like there is a certain kind of imposter syndrome that I have, I think, when it comes to writing about craft, or working with craft and how my craft comes about, in that the truthful, honest answer is just, I don't know. I just kind of want to do something, and I'm curious about it, and something snags me the way that like clothes get snagged on a nail, and I keep looping back around and around to something, and I dream something, I perseverate on something I overhear in a subway, and that those are really my beginning points. And I will say, like, I think like anything in life, you kind of learn. If you're stubborn, you learn the hard way. I think in the beginning of my writing, I really wanted to make, if I was like, this is going to be a novel, and I'd be like this, and I'd like be really dogged about it and keep doing it. And like some things just don't want to be novels. Like some things are like, you're done saying everything you have to say about it in a page and a half, and it is what it is. And my first novel started as a short story. So I think what I have come to, so I think it's sort of similar actually to this idea of certainty and kind of like rigidity and black and white thinking. Like I think what I've come to learn, and it may be that there's no shortcuts to this, it may be that this is just like any muscle, one of practice, but like something that's come to me with time is like trusting that the thing is gonna tell you what it wants to be, And that might be through time, it might be through error, it might be through telling you what it doesn't want to be. But like, I will start to work on something now, and I'm less attached to genre. I'm less attached to the idea of form or genre. It kind of doesn't matter, you know? Like, it matters for marketing-ish and like how you're going to sell something, whatever. But like, in terms of the core and the process, it kind of is very similar for me. And so what I've come to realize is I'm just going to start writing, and I'm going to follow the thread in the ways that I want to follow it, and it'll tell me pretty soon what it wants to be, you know, and like that's it. And I know it's really hard to teach that though, or to talk about it in any way that's useful, actually. But it is.
It's only unuseful because we want certainty.
I think maybe that's what it is. I'm still
want
grappling
clarity.
with that thing, yeah.
I mean, I was a poet because I had a really good poetry teacher. I thought I was going to be a novelist. But I think also what I love about poems is it's like always going on really hot dates. Of like, it's really fun, you have a great time, and then it's over, and you don't have to work on anything. you can revise, but also in the new book, there's a series of poems, the Dear Thanatos poems. I always called them my one-night stands because I'm very book project-y. I sort of do have the relationships that also have the hot dates. And so I'm in a relationship with the book, and I'm doing all of these things, but the Dear Thanatos poems for years and years and years, those were just one-night stands. When I just wanted to write a poem, and like I just was worn out by my relationship, so on the side, I'd have a little adventure with darkness. And I just write to my darkness, and my darkness would always talk back to me. And then I caught feelings for my one-night stands, and they ended up in that last book. But those poems weren't meant to be like part of a thing. And I guess my thought about genre too is like, you should always have something, whether you're calling it blobs, whether you're saying like, I'm just gonna write a bad poem today. I love telling myself I'm gonna write a bad poem. And then if it turns out good, I'm like, yay. But if it turns out bad, I'm like, I did it. And you get to celebrate either way. But I think people should have non-productive creative practices of like, what's the one-night stand for your creative process? Like, what's just the playing?
About that.
Yeah, just one-night stands, everyone. I mean, live your romantic lives the way you want to live those, but like in your creative practice, I think not having every creative piece need to go into the capitalist machine of revision, and then it's in a journal, and then you got to get the book out, and then you got like just make shit because it's fun and feels good, and that it makes you happy. I think I started going towards essays because one, I was no longer learning new things about the poem. At least the poem with my voice in it. Yeah. And so I liked playing with a different genre. I also think I'm getting older, and I get to spend more time thinking about something. I think poems were such a great form for my 20s because I was like, this thing, or maybe my brain is less distracted by squirrels. And so I am slowing down just as a person, and I'm spending more time thinking, maybe ruminating too much, but spending more time on certain ideas. I think both of them, you know, still driven by things I lived through, and both still driven by facts, as in like, I think facts are a way of being intimate with the world. I love learning new things about the world, and I love using, you know, trying to get people interested in my love life or my trauma so that I can actually tell them some cool facts about bees. Of like, most of the time I think I'm just like tantalizing people with my personal life so that I can tell them cool shit I know. Mostly I think that's the treat. It's like putting the peanut butter around the pill for the dog. It's like, I'm like, here's something about my romantic life, but did you know the chameleon's tongue is longer than its body? It's so cool.
Is it?
It is! Wow. And it just rolls up in there.
You learned something.
That's pretty
it's
awesome.
so cool.
That's pretty cool.
It's so cool.
I'm sure everybody approaches this in their own way, but I don't think we really can just pretend that the pandemic is not happening or hasn't happened. And I'm curious how, and maybe it depends where you were living at the beginning, but I'm curious how that has infiltrated your writing, maybe existentially, maybe practically. You spoke a little bit to that, Hala. If any of you have anything to speak to
I
there.
think it's my turn to go first, but I also feel like I already talked about it.
Nope,
I
no
think
pressure.
I think it was just a very dry, awful, like my grandfather died. I just could not, I think of those months as one long walk up First Avenue to the fertility clinic with my like double mask. Like there's a very visceral memory. Like I can like feel exactly in my gut what that, like those first like few months were. And so I think like the legacy of it to me personally is I am so grateful to be in community with other bodies again. And so grateful because it was a really dark time in sort of like, you know, nationally, internationally, and then also on these like personal levels, and you couldn't be with people. You couldn't, like, my grandfather died in Beirut and like no one was there and there was nothing we could do about it. And I think there's something about just being able to share physical space with people again that it still feels new enough that it like catches me sometimes by surprise and I'm like, oh, what a delight. And I also just feel really glad to be making things again, to your point. Like I feel glad to have whatever block, dry spot, whatever you want to call, whatever language you want to call it, to be like curious about the world again. It feels like a real blessing.
Both of my parents worked on farms most of my life. My dad worked on duck farms until he retired. And a true thing about farming is that when you take a cow to the abattoir, if you let him see the cow in front of him being, sorry, this is dark, but if you let the cow in front of him if you let him see the cow in front of him being slaughtered, it releases a stress hormone in the meat and it like ruins the meat, right? Like you guys are not, like you guys know this, we're in the Midwest, but it's like a thing, right? Like you have to design the abattoir so the cows can't see the cows in front of them dying, or so the goat can't see the goat in front of it dying, right? This is also halal meat orbits this principle, but I've been thinking a lot lately about the meatness of myself, you know, like because of the quarantine, you know, like what does having an auto scroll, you know, autoplay snuff film on my phone in between, you know, an ad for toilet paper and an ad for the new Pokemon game, you know, seeing like a snuff film of state murder of an unarmed civilian, what does that do to my meat, right? Like what is like seeing the COVID numbers and like seeing the people on respirators do to my meat, right? I've had a number of relatives die in Iran because of US sanctions that made it so that we couldn't send ventilators and we couldn't send the vaccines, and other countries couldn't send the vaccines to Iran without getting, and so Iran was per capita one of the worst countries in the world for COVID death rates. What does my relatives were living in mortal terror, right? Like mortal terror for themselves and for their family members. I am a tenured professor in Iowa who was morally outraged. You know, the delta between my outrage and their mortal terror is profound, right? I think this is one of the great lessons that BLM taught a lot of people too, right? Is that the delta between your umbrage at injustice happening and someone else's terror that their children are in danger, right? That is a wide gulf, right? And so what responsibility does that imply sitting on this end of the outrage? You see what I'm saying? Sitting on this end of that spectrum, right? Like I wasn't, you know, I'm a healthy, hardy, you know, I run, whatever, you know, I have health insurance, right? I'm the 1% globally. And so what does that imply, right? These are questions that I've been thinking a lot about. Even with my students or my nieces, I think about when I talk on the phone, I tend to pace. I don't know if you guys are like this, like when you're speaking on the phone, like I can't just like sit in a chair and say like, how are you doing, brother? You know, I'm like pacing around, you know what I mean? Like I'm pacing around and I'm, you know, and this is like a universal human behavior. Not everyone exhibits it, but a lot of people do, and people have theorized that the reason is because our lizard brains don't understand the idea of speaking to a voice that we can't see, right? Like there's nowhere in our evolutionary history where we would be speaking at like a room volume speaking voice to a person that we couldn't plainly see, and so we're like subconsciously like just pacing around trying to find that, trying to resolve that dissonance, right? And thinking about that is so sort of charming and sweet and sad. But then like thinking about like my younger niece who just thinks that going into the world means putting on a mask, right? Who like just like straight up like doesn't think it's like a COVID thing. Like she has only existed in a world where when you leave the house you put on a mask, right? Like that's not in response to any. That's just like when you go into the world you put on a mask. So she, you know, doesn't see the bottoms of people's faces emoting outside of the house. You know what I mean? And so like there are like developmental, right? And you know, she attended kindergarten, maybe preschool. I think she attended her preschool, like it was like a Zoom preschool. Like what does Zoom mean to a preschool? Like they can't read, you know what I mean? Like they can't read the like mute button, you know what I'm saying? Like what does Zoom mean to a right? And then like having like, not just the voices, but the like apparitions of your beloved appearing, right, for this period of time. I have a friend who's a cardiologist, I'll stop talking after this, but I have a friend who's a cardiologist in San Francisco, another former student, current friend, who said that so many of his elderly patients, just like their cognitive declines were just accelerated so rapidly because they just weren't getting the reps. You know, they just weren't getting the, because they were in isolation, they just weren't getting like the people talking to them every day or like going to the store and having the, you know what I mean? And just, I mean, it's gonna take generations to unpack, you know, the sort of like cultural, sociological, psycho-spiritual, emotional effects of this thing, right? It's gonna take generations to unpack that, but like the way, it can't be inert, you know what I mean? Like it can't have done nothing to my meat, you know what I mean? That's what I keep thinking about, is like, if that shit makes it so that you can't eat that cow, like I'm not so far evolutionarily removed from that cow that it just does nothing to me, you know what I'm saying? And I don't know what that is, right? I'm not a scientist, I'm not a, you know, neurologist or whatever, but, you know, all inductive reasoning points to the idea that it can't be inert, right? So like figuring out what has shifted in me, what has changed in me, is something I'm really interested in now.
Okay, my cool fact, and I don't know how entomologists figured this out, but the butterfly retains the caterpillar's nervous system. So even though it is reduced to fucking goo inside chrysalis, right? Once it's a butterfly, it still has the same nervous system. And so I've been thinking about this because I've read a cultural history of the phoenix. I've been writing a lot about fire. I've been thinking I hate the phoenix so much because it is such an easy and bullshit metaphor. Because the butterfly retains the caterpillar's nervous system. You cannot live forever. You cannot constantly resurrect yourself without a cost. I can do it. I'm strong. Ugh. But the cost of being a phoenix is being alone. That bird's always alone. And so it's just, and I'm just like exhausted by how many times I've had to restart my life. There's no other choice. But that is the thing I'm thinking about with the pandemic is just how many times I have to keep starting over and how exhausting that is and how everybody's like language of being strong and keep going, and yes, it's all worth it, and yeah, it's all beautiful, but there is, the meat has changed. I still have the same nervous system, and in fact, things show up in my body that are old memories that just haven't been dealt with yet. I mentioned a little bit in my workshop talking about the body as well, that one of the things that I started to do during COVID, because my brain was very foggy, and I felt like I couldn't think right, but my journaling, my writing practice was just one thing from the 5 senses a day. And so even if I couldn't be present in a moment when I'm walking the dog in the cold and I'm just annoyed that it's cold and, you know, like exhausted and like I'm in a field and it smells like cow, but like later I'm like, the smell of cow shit, right? That's my smell of the day. That my feeling was like my skin feeling tight on my cheeks because it was so cold. And as I would do the 5 senses, it would just like help me be in my day better, even if it was retroactive. And because of needing I started to pay a lot of attention to cooking, and you know, these are the same examples as before, I'm sorry, it's not new. But like the papery feel of like the garlic clove and then like getting the paper off and how like slippery, and like what is that feeling? Or just like noticing the feels, the smells, you know, like I'm just like excited to put the onions in the pan with the hot butter and I'm like, there it is. But it didn't take rather than it being a place where I'm like thinking about my to-do list and other things, right? Like I'm just so deeply present when I cook, and it's been serving me still. But I've been thinking about how many the decisions we make about the language we use for ourselves and our lives and others. Because also I always thank my Alexa, and my son makes fun of me, and I was like, when the AI overlords come, you're gonna be glad I was nice to them. But I think also how we treat non-human things it's really important to be polite.
Yeah.
Alexa did me a
You
favor.
don't know what
Why
the
wouldn't I
fuck's
say
gonna
thank you?
happen. They're gonna remember.
But like you can create these habits just like tiny tweaks at a time. But like I just started to be really relaxed at cooking time and deeply present. And then I was like, oh my God. Like I had like inadvertently trained myself or taught myself how to do this just simply because I was just doing a stupid little 5-minute exercise, a beautiful 5-minute exercise, because the language we use really matters. That the language we use changes how we experience those things, the treating AI with respect, using positive metaphors around our relationships and our health and our bodies. I do think all of that is fundamental, and I said it in class, but Ursula K. Le Guin said words are events, and I really fundamentally believe there is energy in our language, and it shapes the way we think about ourselves and the way we think about others. And we can inadvertently train ourselves into having more joy and feeling more present, even as we're goo in the chrysalis.
I love your language. So if we imagine some kind of a continuum where we place activities that create positive growth and change in the world, where do you put poetry? I mean, I guess what I'm saying, do you feel that artists, all writers, not just poets, have an obligation / responsibility to tackle issues related to climate, interstate violence, racism? I mean, we could generate a list with no problem, but where do you personally, do you believe what Auden said about poetry making nothing happen?
The only thing I know that poetry has ever done to change me is made me feel less alone. And I think it's given me a lot of lessons in how to be human, and I'm still trying to figure that. I don't know how to solve global warming. I don't even know how to be a person sometimes. And so, but you know, maybe that's enough, that we just feel less alone because somebody was honest with us, or because somebody said something that kind of shook us awake. I think poetry makes my soul sit up straighter in my body, and for that, I'm really grateful. But Kava had a really great craft talk today, and there was a lot about goodness, and I do think about it all the time, and reactive, stuff, outrage stuff. How do you actually affect change? How do you actually change the world? I don't know, I just give my Planned Parenthood donation every month. Because I don't know how to change the world. I don't think I have the answers. I think I'm a clueless middle-aged human being who's good with words. And I wish I knew more than that. I wish I could help more than that. But the way I think I might help, or I hope I help, is just that people read a poem sometimes and recognize themselves or see something new, and we're like, wow, I didn't know people lived like that or felt like that. But that I'm really working on being as human as possible, which means the poems are gonna be messed up and angry and a little fucked up sometimes, that they might not be the best, they might not be moral, but if maybe they help other people the way they helped me, it might just be with loneliness.
That's beautiful. One of the things I tell, so I teach grad psych students and I supervise them. I'm, like you were saying, a clinical psychologist, and I also have a clinical practice. And one of the things I'll tell beginning clinicians is that you can work with people you don't like effectively. You can treat people you don't like. You can treat people who have done despicable things. It's very hard to treat people you're not curious about. It's really, really hard to do good clinical work if you can't find some kernel of curiosity about them and their context and how they got there and all that. So What I want to say is that I think art matters to a point, and I think poetry matters to a point. However, and I think this you touched on this in your talk of it, I do not think poetry or art is a replacement for actionable change, policy change, being of service in different ways in real time with real people. So it's like necessary, sufficient conditions, right? I think like it can absolutely live in tandem with those things, but I do not think it's a replacement for them. And I think one of the things that happens sometimes is you might feel like you've written about something or thought about something or lectured about something or found a really beautiful way or metaphor to talk about something as though that actually is something that's gonna grow legs and walk out of the room and like, feed someone. And unfortunately it doesn't. But I do think the way poetry can bridge that gap is by incurring or inciting curiosity. And I think that's something that writing and art in general can do. Like I think that I have the first novel was about a Palestinian family. And one of the loveliest things that came out of it that was very unexpected, because I very much wrote it sort of for my community and thinking about my family and a lot of friends and whatever, was that there were a lot of people who knew very little about Palestine aside from what they had been told about it, who reached out and were like, wow, this family made me really curious and invested and interested in this part of the world and in this different narrative. And so I went and I learned about it. So I think like art can play kind of that role, but I am always just mindful of like self-lionizing or like the tendency of artists to be like, I'm an artist. It's like, that's cool. Yeah, okay, what else have you done? Like, I just don't, yeah, it's just not a replacement for like also, again, like actionable things. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I can't improve upon what's been said, but I agree with it all. I think about this a lot. I think about art as a channel of one's goodness, just as, how one behaves with waiters is a channel of one's goodness, sure. And how one treats their grocer is a channel of one's goodness, and how one, behaves towards small animals. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think that it is a channel, right? Which is to say that it's a part of it, but I think that, this is going to sound obnoxious, but I think of poetry in this way very similarly to how I think of prayer, which is to say, when I get on my knees and I pray for my mother, or I pray for the unhoused in my community, which is part of my practice. I do pray. I am a person who prays. I'm not like summoning an interventionist God to like come and like, give everyone a 5-course meal. You know what I'm saying? Like I pray, and then that points me towards the action, which is, maybe I go down to the soup kitchen and I chop onions for an hour that day, right? And that is like my way of being useful that week, right? Is like, I pray for my mom's health, and then I call her and ask her if she's taken her medicine, right? Because sometimes she forgets, right? And that's how prayer works, right? In my life, that's what, I don't know if there's anyone on the other end of the line. Frankly, it's none of my business, right? But I know that being on my knees puts me present towards the intentions that I need, you know what I'm saying? And so if I am holding a resentment towards somebody, praying for that person, praying for patience and grace and dealing with that person reminds me when I deal with that person that I had just asked for this before, and that this person has found this mechanism by which to move through a world that has been rigged against them just like I have, you know what I'm saying? And that is the way in which prayer and poetry both kind of work in my life. I don't write a poem critical of empire and then say, oh, my job is done, or a poem about, the climate crisis and say, oh, my job is done, right? I write a poem about the climate crisis and then, I plant a tree in my backyard with my niece like I did this weekend. You know what I'm saying? Like that's the sort of thing, that's the way that poetry has worked in my life as action, which is to say, the great Iraqi poet Dunya Mikhail says, the poem is not medicine, it's an X-ray, right? Which is to say, like, it's not gonna cure the broken bone, but it'll show it to you, you know what I'm saying? I also think, and this is a slightly spicier take. But I also think that, how do I want to say this? I think that what often, okay, let me back up and be sort of obnoxiously esoteric about it. In physics, the principle of work refers to an object, force applied to an object in order to move it, right? Force applied to an object in order to move it. And so I think often inhabiting the carapace of revolutionary rhetoric and then offering that to a community that more or less already agrees. Like if I say, well, I'm in a church, so I'm like low, but if I say like, Trump is bad, you know, most of the people here I can reliably expect will agree with me, right? You know what I mean? And like if you don't, you know well enough that you're gonna be outnumbered in this like poetry festival. You know what I mean? And so like I'm not really like causing anything to move. You know what I'm saying? Like I'm inhabiting the carapace of, you know, sort of pseudo-revolutionary rhetoric without actually risking anything, right? And I think that a lot of art, I'm obviously creating a caricature of what I'm talking about, but like I think a lot of art is sort of about that ethically complex today. You know, like I think the ethical, I think it's not a coincidence that the dominant cultural artifact of our moment is the Marvel movie, in which you have like a good guy and then a big bad guy chaos agent comes into town, and then the good guy dispels the chaos agent, and then like everything returns to the status quo, right? A return to the status quo is a fundamentally conservative position, and to valorize that, right, is like a fundamentally like regressive take. But I say this to say the people who are doing things that actually feel risky to me, like the poet Jose Olivares has a poem where he says, I don't have health insurance. There's no way to make that beautiful. I don't have health insurance. That's the three lines from his poem, right? He's risking, to my mind, what he's risking is someone saying, oh, that's not a very good poem, right? Someone saying, that's not very beautiful, right? Because that language isn't beautiful. No one's gonna get that tattooed on themselves, right? That's not language that is like, you know, you wanna like recite at your wedding, right? It's ugly. It's ugly, just like the fact is ugly. It's crazy that in a first world nation, right, that anyone has to worry about, you know? And risking our expectations of art being beautiful, right? There's an essay by the poet Phil Meters where he's talking about 9/11, and he says, he has Lebanese family, and he says, I'm almost afraid to write this, but now reflecting on it 10 years later, 15 years, I forget, but he was like, now reflecting on it, I want to write what I thought then, which is now they know how we feel, right? Which is a terrifying thing. Like, even me saying it right now, like, you know, I was paid to come here and talk to you guys, but like, even me sitting here right now, quoting another writer saying that makes me feel scared. You know what I mean? To say something like that, right? But it's true, like, you know, like in 1988, a US naval warship shot a civilian Iranian airplane out of the sky, right? And 290 people, including 66 children on board, were killed, right? If Iran had shot the plane that we took to get here out of the sky, Iran would be turned to glass. You know what I'm saying? Like Iran would be, you know what I'm saying? Like it was just a civilian plane. You know what I'm saying? These things happen every day all around the world, right? But for Phil to say that in a piece, that felt like risk to me. You know what I'm saying? You know, people have been writing about like eating ass and smoking pot since the 50s. Yeah, I'm sorry, now I'm really, but you know what I mean? Like Ginsberg wrote Howl in the 50s, you know what I mean? Like this stuff isn't, I mean, it's like, it like sounds like it's risky, it sounds like it's being provocative, but it's like, people have been saying this stuff for like 75 years in American literary writing, or you know what I mean? Like what actual risk looks like today often isn't the sort of like sexy, bombastic, you know, that sort of stuff. Anyways, I don't even remember what the question was, sorry.
I want to take a bank shot off what you just said. It seemed to me in Pilgrim Bell that, and push back if this isn't right, but you speak pretty explicitly about who suffers and who watches, and it's much more political. I don't know who said this. If I had known how long this would linger with me, I would have paid more attention. But I read this statement, and I'd love to hear your response to it, particularly since we have a gardening theme. And the statement is, colonizers write about gardening. It's a good one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very provocative.
What is there like an were they like?
There's no context.
Okay.
I mean, I was kind of assuming it was metaphorical and,
Sure.
you know, cultivation and all of
I'm
that.
trying to think of like the famous colonial gardening example. Like it's hard to just reflect on an abstract assertion without like clinging it to.
What made me defensive about my tomato poems, and I don't,
Sure.
don't think that's
Yeah.
what.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like Palestinian poets write about date tree. It just does, like I'm reflexively skeptical of the certainty of the statement, which I guess is.
Yes, thank you.
Well, no,
I
I'm,
think
I'm
also,
No,
yeah, I mean,
it's
colonizers write about all
it's-
sorts of things. They
Yeah,
write,
yeah,
they
yeah,
write
like
about their
everyone writes
suffering.
it.
They
Yeah.
write about their, they write
I
about
don't
their
want
suffering.
colonizers to get a monopoly on garden writing. You know what I mean?
That and also I think like it's, yeah, I mean, like colonizers write about suffering too.
Yeah,
Like they
yeah,
write
yeah.
about the
Yes.
things that, I mean, yeah, I think yeah.
Yeah.
I also heard that eco-poets who aren't overtly political in their work are
your
called
grief.
moss poets or something. Somebody was telling me
Gardens are
on
ours.
Twitter. But for me, a lot of it is to that flexing of I am more aware than you, or I'm doing more work than you, and you aren't trying, like your work isn't X, Y, or Z, or like doing it the way that I believe work needs to be done. But I also, beautiful thing about middle age is like, I have no fucking idea.
Middle age.
I have no idea even why I've made some of the decisions I have or why I'm making the decisions I am. I certainly don't have an answer to crises. I don't think I get to tell anyone else how to make their work. I don't think I know anything certain about poetry. But like thinking about how to be good, I used to teach superheroes in American literature. And one of our biggest takeaways was about how superheroes are always reactive rather than proactive. It is the thing of like somebody, they all, so we would do on our acts of service, we would have like goodness days where we went out and tried to make people's days brighter. And then we had a hero for a day project where we picked somebody and gave them the best day of their life, or tried to, you know. We would find out secret things about them, and then we would show up in bear costumes to bring them coffee in the morning, and we'd do these silly, fun things. Because goodness is not showy. We like heroes, and which isn't to say we shouldn't love our firefighters and like love, you know, like the people who come to rescue, but we reward heroism and not caregiving. We want one big spectacle, one big moment, not the ongoing and arduous care of others. And that's just the way our culture works, and that's how we want to define goodness, is the loudest voice in the room, the riskiest running into the building on fire, the dude in the cape who frankly made some of these problems start and has all the capital in the world to address some of the systemic issues in his city, and he's not doing it. But it also, to finish the hero metaphor also, they have the same fucking origin story. I'm sorry I'm swearing so much. It's too much passion, I'm sorry. Okay, no more F-bombs. They have the same origin, which is grief. Both the heroes and the villains, like Mr. Freeze just wants to bring his wife back. He's just hurting. He just sucks at grief. And I think it's true though. Okay, Katie, I know we need to talk about Marvel and we have a lot of thoughts. Okay, but but I think, again, I think poetry is actually really good at reminding us what to be alive for, and I think it's also really good at making us feel less alone in our grief. And if a big piece in what makes somebody an a-hole or, you know, a sociopath who poisons the city water and, you know, takes over the Thanksgiving parade, that's a Joker reference and not anything that's happening. If grief is what can drive people to great horrors, but supposedly it's also what drives our heroes, then I think figuring out how we, I hate this phrase, but how we suffer better, how we manage our suffering, how we find community in our suffering. Batman needs a family, right? Like, I think there are still some corny messages in there, but for me, that going back to feeling less alone and learning from others, sharing in that, feeling seen, the tears that stay visible on the cheeks, right? I feel like our writing are the visible tears of things we have lived through. And I do think if we are with each other bodily and also on the page, then I do think it helps. It doesn't fix it. It's the x-ray, not the medicine. But
I think
it
too,
helps.
in your writing, the progression in your books is that there's more playfulness there. My sense is there's a little more mischief in every book. Not in any way to minimize or erase the shadow. I mean,
Yeah.
God, those essays about your friend's murder and that poem about the, I can't even say it, the active shooter, and you
Yeah.
as a mom and you as a teacher. Obviously, declining marriage. All of those things are in there, but they're alongside a quality of lightness that comes in, which for me broadens the aesthetic and maybe reduces my anxiety a little. I don't know. How do you manage that in such weighty times? Because sometimes we just feel real earnest, you know,
Yeah.
and that's kind of boring.
I mentioned this at the craft talk as well, so if, for those who just already heard it, I'm sorry. But I always try and think about the reader as somebody I love. And that doesn't guarantee that I want to be good at love so bad. It's like the biggest goal I have with my whole life is like, I just want to be good at loving people. I think it's like the coolest, most amazing thing we get to do. And I really want to be good at, but that doesn't mean I do it perfectly, which doesn't mean like all of my poems that I nail it. But if I think in revision about how can I be generous to this person, how can I be careful with the things I reveal, how can I both try and communicate and allow for complexity. I heard Carl Phillips say it, but I think it was somebody else that he was quoting, but that the world is not a clear place, and do we dishonor it by trying to be too clear about it? To reduce it to, statements like, colonizers get the gardens or whatever, of like, it usually can't be reduced to a statement, thank God, if they're there. And for me, it's not a surefire way. I don't have answers for anyone, even myself, but that's a good North Star for me of like thinking about, do I love the other person on the end of this poem? To make sure I'm careful with them and speak to them and to myself, because maybe that's also who's on the other end of the poem, with as much grace as possible. And yeah, to make my poems, even if they're dark, I still want to restore people to themselves at the end. Also, I think I am healing and I think I am happier. And I also think poems are part of how I've gotten there. Oh my gosh, we're past time.
Do you have suggestions for how to introduce a little more playfulness, complex tone?
I can't improve upon what Tracy said.
I think that was so
Yeah.
beautiful.
It was
great.
pretty good.
Beautiful.
Okay,
And
that's
it brought
good.
tears to my eyes. Yeah, I don't want to
We can
know.
leave it there. I want to talk a minute about use of self in poetry, and Hal, I'll start with you because as therapists, we're trained to bear witness and to listen and to take in others' stories and kind of pour it through the sieve of ourself and before we respond. And for me, that seems very similar to writing. But we can't assume that the I is the poet. So I'm curious what you think is the obligation of the poet to the truth when using first-person singular. And I'm thinking about your wonderful novels where, particularly in The Arsonist City, where all of the characters have the same experiences but very different points of view. How do you get at that with poetry?
I do not think we have an obligation towards anything if we use the I in poetry. And maybe I say that because I've hidden behind poetry a lot. And so I think, the 29th year, I wrote a lot about I started writing about queerness and sex and addiction and things like that a little bit more directly. And I had some family pushback, and I was like, it's poetry. Can you relax? It's just a book of poems. And so, I don't know if you understand what poetry is, and so I think there's something about that I like. I as someone that's working on nonfiction now, I like that in poetry you have the capacity to be costumed or costume or play with the self or play with different versions of the self. I think like, I think in the 29th year I played with the I a lot, and some of it was like imaginal I, and some of it were these sort of like imaginary futures, and some of them were like sort of past versions of the self that, would have happened if this had changed or that had changed. So I think just being able to sort of play with kind of like internal family systems work in therapy, where there's like sort of the exiled self and there's the firefight, like there's different parts of the self. Bringing that onto the page is, I think has been really lovely. But I don't know that I feel like there are any rules in general about any of this stuff. Like I kind of think that it is whatever resonates with you, and I've long said this, like you can write about whatever you want, and you have to be able to answer to it. And that's it. Those are the two combinations, right? Like you can do whatever you want, and then also you have to be able to speak to that thing that you did.
That's where the responsibility comes
That's where accountability comes in, right? Because I think we'll sometimes have classes where people will be like, well, okay, so like I'm a white, cis, whatever, and I want to write about this kind of character from this kind of background, and like people are saying I can. I'm like, I don't know that anyone's telling you can't. But also like you can do whatever you want, but like people are also then entitled to have reactions to it. And so thinking about like the concept of accountability when we think about the ways that self intersects with and authenticity intersects with writing, I think that's something that I've been trying to work with some students in particular around. Yeah.
So, what's your poetic superpower? A lot of us know Greg Orr's template, the story, music, imagination, and form. What do you rely on the most? And then also, the second part of that question is, how do you move beyond that which you do well, your own algorithms and things that repeat? How do you retain the things that make you you as a writer and shake it up and do something new?
Well, I've just written a novel, and that is not something that I've ever done.
I'm impressed.
While everyone was off learning Esperanto or writing Lear or whatever over
sourdough bread,
my thing was to teach myself narrative. I have been within the creative writing academy for a minute now, though I will say that I knew the 4-sentence types because I used to teach middle school, and like I used to have to teach that, and that's where I learned the 4-sentence types, was as a middle school teacher, not in any sort of higher ed. So in my, I'll put that feather in my proletariat bona fides, but I'm also fasting right now, so my brain is just moving really slow. I apologize if I sound like I'm like, thank you, I appreciate it. I appreciate the affirmation. So my thing over quarantine was that I was going to learn narrative, and I approached it as a total, I think that my superpower, insofar as I have one, is just like ultra discursive thinking, you know what I mean? Like I tend to think like 7 valences away from the thing that I'm actually thinking about, and then sort of like work my way back to it, right? Which is great for poetry, terrible for narrative, right? Yes. And so over quarantine, I read 2 novels a week and watched a movie a day, and I was trying to understand, the thing that I was really good at was not good at, but the thing that came very naturally to me was having like interesting people have heady conversations with each other. You know what I mean? Like that was,
That's my worst.
Yeah.
Terrible. Page turner.
It's not. I've read your work. It's not. But like that was a breeze, because again, that's functionally how poetry works. Is you just have like an interlocutor in whom you're curious, right? And you just sort of let them wax. But yeah, getting people through doorways and onto planes and like sat at the same table.
That's so funny.
Yeah, it was like,
really funny.
it was so hard. Like it's like, and I would just watch like, and like with the movies that I was watching, because like the novels, I just have so many cavities in my content knowledge that I was just like trying to plug and every time I plugged a hole, like 2 more would pop up. It was like one of those old cartoons, But yeah, I was just trying to plug the holes in my content knowledge. But with the movies, I would just watch anything, you know, truly anything. And so like one day I'd be watching like Cassavetes, and the next day I'd be watching like Pineapple Express or whatever. And like what I was really interested in was just how like movement worked, right? Like how characters met each other, how they, you know, went into the rising action, how they like found their way to the, you know, how you signaled the end of the end of a second act, the start of the third, you know what I mean? Like just like, I remember, we shouldn't be quoting Derek Walcott, he was a bad guy, but I'm gonna quote him real quick and you'll forgive me for it. I don't mean to say we shouldn't, you should take whatever you want from him. I believe in reparative reading, not paranoid reading. There's a famous anecdote about him teaching a playwriting class, and this now famous poet, who I won't name because I can't remember if this was told to me or if I read it, was taking this class and said, and had written this play about these two characters who were locked in a cage, and they were having this, you know, big heady conversation, and it was like really interesting and dynamic, and they were like locked in a cage the whole time. And then Derek Walcott at the end of it was like, no one's gonna give a shit about your play unless they know where they piss, you know? You know, you know, and you know, and if they're like locked in a cage, you know, it's like, well, that's probably germane, you know, and it's like, and that was so hard for me, you know, like metaphorically speaking, like knowing where my characters piss, you know, in my novel, you know, like again, like I know how to write sentences, but I don't know how to write scenes, you know what I mean? Yeah. And so just like truly starting at the beginning and just like studying in the manner of like, you know, figuring out how a watch works by taking apart like 30 of them, you know what I mean? Which I don't even know if that would work, but there's something about like the irreducible complexity of a watch, so that was a bad example, but you know what I'm saying, like and that was thrilling to me because it was like so working against the thing that I feel like I'm naturally good at, you know?
I can't wait to read your novel. I
can't wait to share it.
I'm gonna keep thinking about where they're pissing. Yeah. I'm reading. I'm really gonna be.
I swear to God,
I'm gonna be on the lookout.
Yo, every chapter, like that is like a real.
It's an
question
answered
that I was-
question.
Yeah. It's probably like artlessly demarcated. You know what I mean? Like it's like, and they got the money from this,
Like really
from the, you know,
clunky exposition.
Yeah.
He said, gesturing towards the toilet.
Yeah. He gestured towards the tree, which was as tall as a 6'4" tree. You know.
Oh man, that's great. My poetic superpowers. I think that I'm very quick, which I'm very grateful for. I'm fast, and I'm all about instant gratification. So I'm all about like, let's do it, let's done, here's a poem, it's great. I think also the other superpower is that I'm not precious with my work, which feels, I mean, I think now having known a lot of writers, unusual, and I'm very grateful for that. So like I will write what I'll write. I hate revision, I hate editing, and I hate revising. And I feel completely fine putting it in the hands of like editors or agents or whatever and being like, what do you think? And I write very wordy, very long first drafts of everything. And so both novels had like probably 100 to 150 pages cut from them because they were like, this is not sellable. We don't know what you're doing here. And then with the poetry collection, yeah, like I know people that will really, I mean, the order of poems and the way they're sectioned off is like an art. And I'm very good at being like, I'm very good at outsourcing things that are not my strengths. And I'm very good at being like, this I'm good at, this I'm not that great at. And so the 29th year I worked with Jenny Zhu at Houghton Mifflin, Jesus, yikes. Well, they were eaten at this point, so it doesn't matter, but like Houghton Mifflin. and Jenny, and I like literally wrote Jenny and I was like, look, I have all the poems and they're in a Word document and I don't really know how to even begin to put them in order. And she was like, really? I can do whatever I want? And I was like, please. And she ordered it and she did this amazing job and she figured out what the sections could be. And I feel like that is something that might feel invasive for another writer or intrusive or something like that. And I'm like, beautiful, like that's your strength. It's not one of my strengths. And like, it worked out.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I don't mean to brag, but I've been called extra before.
No way. That was hyperbole, I'm sure.
But I think if people like too much, I'm a good person for that. Of like, I'm fine to be a subway spreader. I like to take up space. I like to add, every noun gets a couple of adjectives. Like all the accessories will be on. If you like, you know, a sundae with the bananas and the whipped cream and the cherries and the sprinkles, like, I'm your gal. But I'm not good, you know, so then I struggle with brevity. It's hard for me to, like, cut it off. A library asked me for 16 poems that were 150 words or less, and I was like, what? So I could take a poem and turn it into tiny little things. But actually, that request has been really beautiful for me because now I'm quick. It's a single draft. I am trying to get this library their 16 poems for their park walk, and and I don't care. But I mean, that sounds terrible, but it's so nice to just, normally I'm trying to, you know, fashion myself, understand myself, hold a mirror up to myself. Right now, I'm just having a good-ass time playing. I'm just having fun. I'm just taking things from my day. I still want it to be, there's still too many adjectives, but I am able to cut it off at 100 to 150 words, and it was sometimes getting the request or making something for others explicitly, right? You can always say like, oh, the reader, but like when you're like getting commissions or where people want specific things from you, it's my favorite thing about working in a laureateship is that I don't feel attached to the poems in the same way, and I actually kind of like that. It's not like, oh, it's not great art, or it's not as meaningful to me. I don't think they're terrible poems, but I'm just having fun, and I'm just getting to give people what they're asking for. It's like taking commissions in other kind of art, and I kind of like just being able to let go and not torture myself, and like, do I fully understand myself through this poem that I have written? And like, sometimes they're just selfies, right, instead of portraits, and it's kind of fun, and it is kind of nice not to have to, you know, I actually do love revision, and when I'm working on my own poems that are about me-ish, a me-ish kind of I, then I do torture them for a very long time. But it is kind of nice to take a break from that and just, the little selfies.
Can I add, it reminds me of, there's an Al-Anon concept of detach with love. And like I really love that concept in life, and I really love it in writing. Because I think that's also a really nice way to keep reorienting your North Star back to like the process. Why do I like this? Do I like it for the result? Do I like it for the book? Do I like it for the what? I mean, not really, if I'm completely honest. I don't, you know. It can be a perk, but I actually find publishing and final products to be oftentimes a very grief-filled process. You know, I'm saying goodbye to a thing so if I can kind of recenter what I really love about it, which is the doing of it and the making of it, then it really facilitates this kind of detachment. But like you're saying, it's not a bad thing when you're like, I don't care. It's like, yeah, it's done with love. Like this is not, it's kind of not mine anymore once I'm done. That's sort of how I feel about things. It's finished and now it's out in the world.
That makes sense. Yeah. I'm mindful of the time.
Oh, wow.
I want to make sure that people who are in the audience have an opportunity to ask questions. I had a couple more things, but I got engrossed and kind of lost track. So are there folks who have inquiries? Okay, then I'll just keep
They're
going.
great
I got a couple
questions.
more. And if someone thinks of something, holler. We have about 10 more minutes, I think. If place and history shape who we become, both as writers and people, I'm curious if there's a place or a memory that really maybe draws out the fullness of who you are, but I'm really more interested if there are places or times in your life that you have zero curiosity about or no interest in exploring.
Childhood.
That's a really, really good question. That reminds me of Joan Didion's like, stay on nodding terms with yourselves, or else they're going to come up in the middle of the night. I'm a terror. By the way, can I just say, I'm shocked by how many quotes you both remember and how effortless, you're like, as the sculptor blah, blah said, and then you say the full line. I've literally been quoted back things I've said and been like, oh.
Oh, I'm much better at remembering things.
Smart.
What?
But I gave
It's
away.
remarkable.
I gave away that in the craft talk of like I begin every book by blessing the book and writing down my favorite quotes about
So then you
poetry.
remember
so
them
over and
that
over and over and
way.
over again, every time I begin a journal, I'm blessing it with the best writing possible. And so it always has like. So I'm rewriting these quotes over and over and
Okay,
over again.
okay.
So like they've just been with me for
Thanks
years.
for making me feel better.
Yeah, I just.
Because I've been like, are they geniuses? And am I an idiot? Like,
Okay. I really like that question. I would say I'm not that curious about the time I spent in Oklahoma as in grade
You
school.
have a really good poem about Oklahoma, though.
I do, and you know
it's
what's
complicated.
funny? See, writing is like a Rorschach test where it's like it shows things that are in your subconscious without you seeing them. Like I had someone come up to me after a reading once and was like, I teach your book and blah, 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 and we look at the birds in this book. And I'm like, I don't even know what the fuck. I've never written about a bird a day in my life. And then that night I went home and I looked through it and I counted it and there were like 42 birds. And they were everywhere. And so there's something about like, my subconscious leaves its fingerprints on all of, and because I don't like to revise and because I'm like, it's not mine anymore, take it world, I don't actually know what's in it a lot of the time. And so I think there's been something, there have been times where I would say consciously, I'm like, I don't really care that much about like the time in Oklahoma, because it was a really shitty time. We just left, my parents had sought asylum, we just left Kuwait, blah, 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 and I was like not doing great there socially. But it does sneak up in some of the stuff that I write. And so it does come up, but I would say at least in terms of what I find accessible, that's a version of myself that I do not spend probably enough time with. And she's probably gonna show up and wreck everything at some point. Yeah.
I think that I'm kind of in the time that I'm not interested in.
That's a great answer.
No,
Here
I really,
and now.
Well, I really do.
You're like right now here with all of you is the moment.
No, I just, it's a beautiful question and not one I think I've ever been asked before. But, I had, as everyone did, I had a difficult childhood and, so many of the ways that and then I went from a difficult childhood to like a kind of like rapscallion rumspringa for I was being a little I was a little fella and I mean you guys know my work it's Googleable and now I'm just like I'm comfy, you know what I mean? Like I'm fine, and it's like I'm interested in other people and in history and in time, and I'm interested in the people that I've been and the ways in which the person that I've been sober for, if I don't mess up between now and July, I'll have been sober for a decade, and it'll be a thing. Thank you. It feels very, thank you. It's a thing where growing up, in Islam or in Arabic, you would say inshallah when you talk about like the future, and my parents would always talk about like the farmer who was like, yeah, we'll have a big harvest this year, but he forgot to say inshallah, and so then, God like withered his crops, and so like I have like that sort of like, like a retributive God thinking about, anytime I acknowledge something happening in the future without also acknowledging the possibility of like my dying before it happens or whatever, that I'll be like sort of struck by an Olympian thunderbolt or something, but I'm I had zany adventures, and I was like, I would tell people, I would literally, like this sentence would come out of my mouth, I would tell people, I'm just living the poems, I'm not writing, and I would say that with this chilling lack of irony, and people would, you know what I mean, but it kind of turned out to be true, like I was just much more, like I'm like a tenured guy with a dog, you know what I mean, like nothing interesting happens to me, but interesting stuff happens to the world, and interesting stuff has happened to the world, and interesting stuff happens sort of psycho-spiritually, and maybe like fasting is a way of sort of inducing that, but yeah, I would say that, I'm interested in the future and I'm interested in the past, and weirdly I feel not very connected to the present.
That's really interesting.
That is really interesting.
I hate my childhood. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to write about it. I don't want to talk about it. Therapists are always like, tell me about your mother. I'm like, God, this shit again. But actually, the question's also making me think about how I think I spent a lot of my childhood imagining my mother's childhood. And it has been even like an adult question of like, if I had a time machine, the thing I would do is go back and love my mom as a child so that she could have grown up into the kind of person who could have loved me better. And I know, like, not only is that not possible, but I don't know that, is it only love that she needed? That's what she said she needed. Is it because she wasn't loved well enough that she did the things that she did and said the things that she said? And could I just go back and love her right or enough or something and fix that? But I just look back on I've always wondered why people are interested in their childhoods. I'm like, oh, stupid. I had to live through it. I don't want to think about it some more. So I just like, am not curious about, but I will say my child is forcing me to kind of recall certain moments, and yeah, subconsciously things will show up. Or things like, I'll have these like knee-jerk responses to things, and I'll be like, oh my God, Tracy, you need to reflect on why that. Like, I was watching Grey's Anatomy to connect with my students, and because I teach medical humanities, and so they all watch it, right? And I had to have cute, fun memes that would relate to the content. And so I was watching Grey's Anatomy, and the main character, who has like, to be the most tragic character and cry in every episode, she's recovering like this memory of her mom trying to die in front of her. And I was like, only once, suck it up, you pansy. And I was like, maybe we need to take a minute. If a whole writer's room is like, you know what the worst backstory is we can think of for a person? Maybe we should take a minute and think about why we think this isn't a big deal. Or like, you know. So I just like have to keep confronting things from childhood all the time. Or it breaks my heart because, you know, then I wouldn't do things to my son that were done to me. And it does make you have to be like, God, how much pain did somebody have to be in order to do that? Or, you know, so you do end up having, like, but I don't want to think about it, but I'm going to have to. And, yeah, but childhood's stupid. Yeah. I hope my son is a beautiful one.
And on that note, we're going to close with a little nod to our legacies, and I'm wanting to know whose shadow you walk in, who are your poetry heroes.
Besides the rest of the panel?
It can be whoever you want, Tracy. No rules.
I always forget. This just happened earlier. It's like I've never read a book in my life.
Turns out I can't name another poet. I'll start.
Yeah, please go.
I will say that, you know, we talk about, I think that epigenetics is like a very sort of voguish, you know, topic, especially in talking about like intergenerational trauma and stuff like that. But if you believe in the existence of something like intergenerational trauma, then probably also you believe in that, like, wouldn't it stand to reason that you have like intergenerational strengths too, right? Yeah. And then, you know, thinking about, you know, not to be like too sort of self-aggrandized, you know, I've never, well, but, you know, like in Iran, there's like a very deep culture of poetry, right? Mm-hmm. Like Shiraz is like, there are like thousands and thousands of pilgrims at Shiraz every day to visit the grave of Hafez. You know what I'm saying? Like it is like, there's like nothing, there's like no equivalent of that in the States. No. There's not like, maybe like visiting Graceland and Elvis and stuff, you know, but it's like if Elvis lived like 600 years ago. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, there's nothing like, it's not a religious thing. You know, the joke is that in every Persian household, there are two books, the Quran and Hafez, and only one gets read. You know, you know, and it's like there's just no equivalent of it. You know, there's nothing like that in America. You know, like there's no corollary, right? And so, you know, I'm not saying, this is not me saying like I am like Hafez and Rumi and Saadi, you know, but it is like there is a long lineage of deep respect and reverence for the capacity of the spoken word, artfully, mellifluously arranged to thin the partition between us and the divine, right? And that is what I'm up to, right? And I think that Whether that divine be a capital G God who sits on a throne in heaven and gets mad when we lie, or whether that be, whether our divine is land or justice or grace or, our children or whatever, And so, yeah, I would say being able to write into that tradition, which has preceded me by millennia and will continue long after the last person has forgotten my name, feels feels like a really big privilege.
I'm going to take Hafiz too.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, just Hafiz.
That's it. Hafiz. I would say Hafiz. I would say Darwish. I would say that I was given a book of poetry by an English teacher when I was in Beirut, like 14 or something, by Suhair Hamad, who was this, American-based Palestinian poet writing about things like 9/11, and I was just like, really? That is something that can be done? And again, it's interesting to have read things while in the Middle East. Like I spent so much of my life in the Arab world and then going back and forth, but that was really transformative. And I think in terms of fiction, that like Jhumpa Lahiri, I would say the first two books I remember reading and being like, I can like feel that in my bones, were Amy Tan and Jhumpa Lahiri, and they both were these sort of like multi-generational story. No.
I just want to say, I think poetry in general is the family I always wished I had. Like I do when I go to writing conferences and see people, it really is like a family reunion to me. I genuinely love so many poets and feel seen by them in ways my own family doesn't, and like understood, cared about. And that's not to say every poet is a great person, but I have received so much care within the community of poets. And that's the people that I've learned from, the people that I'm still learning from, the dead that I feel close to. Susan reminded me that I gave this recommendation, which I heard Gregory Orr talk about, and I might have misunderstood. That's my other secret power, is I misunderstand all the time. But I actually feel like my mishearings work out to my benefit, or I read really fast, and the way I misread turns into a line for me because it turns out not to be what actually was there. But he said that he gave us all a quest during this craft talk, and he said the quest is to hand copy all the beloveds into a book. And so I hand copy all of my favorite poems in a book. Susan says she's on volume 2 now. I'm also on my volume 2, but every time I encounter, I think I started with John Donne's Batter My Heart, Three-Person God. For you as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend. So I started with John Donne. And then I think I have Bridget Pegeen Kelly, who I tattooed on my arm like an idiot. She would have hated that, but I love her, so she's with me now. Then I just kept, and I do have, Robert Frost and Louise Glick and Linda Gregg and Hafez, and I do have all sorts of, and I have a bunch of Neruda and Lorca and everybody that I have loved and learned from, Czesław Miłosz and James writes poems, and I'll read some tonight. I'm thinking, my next book is called Love Prodigal, and part of what I did was I went back and reread everything that made me fall. I fell out of love with poetry. We had to get the spark back. So then I went on dates with all the books that I loved, and I wrote back. I used the titles in my first book and would write response poems to myself to try and fall back in love and find the first thing again. And so I will tonight when I read to talk about the other people that are in the poem, the other songs that inspire things, the other poets that have inspired things, and the lineage that I want to be a part of so bad. Not in some way like end up in somebody's book someday as like a hand-copied beloved. I just want to live in a way in which I am a hand-copied beloved. But it's the best family that I have ever found. And I don't know if I'm climbing on their shoulders to write anything at all, as Kava's brought up, what could I do to improve upon Milton? What can I say or do? But I think it's not even about improving upon or doing better. It's just enjoying the table and feasting alongside language and people whose presences and way of being in the world is something you enjoy and respect and want to celebrate.
I love that. Thank you. Beautiful. Thank you for this lively conversation.
Thank you for your great questions.
It was really fun. Thank you. Woo.
And those were really good questions, because you can't have a good conversation without good questions.
Those were excellent.
I don't know.
So you're a
But
therapist too, is that right?
I am.
Is that what I heard?
That's one reason I was so geeked when Hala was coming, because I'm like, oh, trauma and poetry.
Those are the questions of a good therapist. Those are the questions of a good
Part of
therapist.
your life are you not
Right?
interested in?
Well, you know,
That's an excellent question.
So be sure you all come back at 6 tonight for the finale to hear them read. And fill out an evaluation or a donation slip or both.
Interesting.